right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the side event that's been pulled together by Topsoe. Thank you very much to the We Mean Business Pavilion for hosting this discussion. Really important to my organization, the future of sustainable aviation fuel and how we can work together to deliver the scale-up in sustainable aviation fuel. So I thought I'd give just a little overview of where we think we are with this discussion. And then we've got Jane Hoope from ICAO who will be making a few remarks. And then we'll have a panel session for the rest of the hour, try and wrap up just before 1 o'clock. So just to give you an idea, if this works. There we go. Just to give you an idea who my organization is, we're the Air Transport Action Group. Our job is to bring together all the different parts of the aviation industry side to work on long-term challenges, and of course climate change is the most pressing of those long-term challenges. So we really focus in on sustainability and climate change, bringing together airports, airlines, air traffic management organizations, the makers of aircraft and engines, and I think important to this discussion, a lot of sustainable aviation fuel producers as well, because we understand the importance of SAF in our long-term climate strategy. Just to give you a bit of background, one of the things that we like to do is look back at where we've come from in the climate journey. And if you look here at the slide going back to 1990 and all the way up to 2050, the red line and the red dotted line looks at where our CO2 emissions would be given the growth in traffic out to 2050 if we were still operating at the same level of technology and efficiency as we were back in 1990. And the blue dotted line shows where we will be in 2050 if we continue operating at today's level of aircraft technology and efficiency. So you can see there's quite a big gap there in the efficiency improvements that we've made over time. In fact, we've avoided over 11 gigatons of CO2 because of those efficiency improvements over those 30 years. But of course, what this also demonstrates to us is we will potentially be around 2 gigatons of CO2 in 2050 from the aviation sector if we don't do everything we can to get ourselves down to the net zero goal. And that's the big question that we have as an industry, and what we've been working on diligently is how do we use technology, operations and infrastructure improvements, the new types of fuel that we'll be talking about today, and then market-based measures to deal with any residual emissions to get us down to that net zero goal by 2050. If we look at some of the options that are available to us as an industry, and this is sort of giving a big picture before we get stuck into the SAF side of things, we know that we can potentially look to electric or hybrid electric opportunities in the smaller commuter size aircraft market. So these are sort of 19-seat passenger aircraft that fly to remote communities and small island states around the world. That's an opportunity for us to explore before 2030, but it really is quite limited from an electric aircraft side in terms of size of aircraft available. There's also a lot of discussion, a lot of research going on with regard to hydrogen as a potential source of direct combustion in aviation. But that will be around the short haul size of the market and probably from 2035 to 2040 timeframe. So what we really need to do is to really scale up the sustainable aviation fuel opportunities that exist in our medium and long haul market, which make up 75% of aviation CO2 emissions. That's really why we're focused in a very heavy way on SAF at the moment. And what that looks like, according to some work that we did back in 2021 called our Waypoint 2050 report, it looks like we need to get up to about 500 million tons of SAF every year by 2050 on a global level to get to that net zero goal. So that's our big challenge, and that's what we want to tackle today in the discussion. Where are we now? So you'll see on screen here a group of 50 or so airlines that have already signed up to commitments to use a certain quantity of SAF by 2030. So some of them have said that they want to do 5%, most of them are in the 10% bracket. And this is a small number of airlines when you look at the number of airlines there are in the world, but actually these represent about 40% of global traffic. So about 40% of the fuel use in aviation is with these airlines. So that's a real big chunk of the market that's already committed. So that's on a voluntary basis, of course. On a regulatory basis or a policy basis, we're already starting to see SAF policies coming in over 45 countries around the world at the moment. So some of them have actually got them in law, some of them are progressing through the legal process and the legislative process at the moment. But what this suggests is that by 2030 at least, we'll need 20 million tons of SAF in order to meet these regulatory requirements that are on us. And where is SAF potentially going to be produced by 2030? This is some analysis that's been done by Sky Energy, looking at the already announced plants and the volumes that might be available from those plants by 2030. So you can see that even though the discussion is a bit more mature in Europe and North America, actually this is something that needs to be looked at around the world, and that's really the focus of our panel here today, is how can we make sure that it's a global story rather than just a Europe and North America story. But of course this is 2030, and if we were to use my numbers from just before for 2050, we'd need to look at this as a potential supply of SAF. And this is really where it becomes a real challenge, but also a real opportunity for a lot of countries in the world as well. So that was really just to maybe set the scene for a bit of discussion. Very happy to invite Jane Hoope, who is the Deputy Director for Environment at the International Civil Aviation Organization, and has been really leading a lot of this work alongside us on the government side of the action. So Jane, please, a few remarks from your side. Where do you think we are on SAF at the moment?
Thank you, Alden. So happy to be here. For those that are not so familiar with ICAO, let me just say we are a UN body, a specialized agency that comprises of 193 member states, more or less the same size of the UNFCCC. Our main role is as a global regulator of aviation. So when you step into an aircraft, you are stepping into 15,000 global standards produced by ICAO, adopted by this 193 states, and in consultation with 100 organizations, which is a big step. So I would like to start by saying that we have two very historical achievements that that permeates our discussion on SAF. The first one was 2 years ago, where we finally adopted in our assembly the Net Zero 2050 as a goal for international aviation, and that allowed us to connect with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And last year, we had a big conference specifically on our cleaner energy transition framework. And in that discussion, coming from the decision on Net Zero 2050, it was clear for us that cleaner energy was the one that will be delivering to us most of the emissions reductions to get to the net zero. So we had to focus on that. And in that conference, we have established a specific goal, and how then showed some of commitments of aircraft, but our states committed to a short-term goal we call by 2030 to reduce 5% of all the CO2 produced by international aviation by the use of cleaner energies. That means that if we say that we are now around 1% of our production, we would be 6 or 7 times more. We have to do 6 or 7 times the production we have today by 2030 to get to that 5% reduction on CO2. As SAF, for example, which is what we can deliver right now, it's up to 80% of life cycle. We have to do some calculations. So 5% of CO2 reduction, that goes to 6, 7. So this is a big challenge. That's what I wanted to tell you. And our main drive right now is the question that Haldane asked me, where are we with the implementation? So bear with me. That framework that we have agreed with 193 states says the following. Okay with the goal. Okay with the long-term goal and the short-term goal for the SAF. Up. But we have 4 elements in that framework. The first one together with this goal comes the monitoring of the goal and the revision of our roadmap as we go in light of how we are performing. So big time monitoring. We are going to look at it in the next CAF, next conference. That will be before 2028. And that's very short. So we have this mission to not to start using SAF. We are using SAF. We already have 1% of that being produced. That is being used by many airlines. But we have to accelerate the SAF to be able to meet that goal. And so the implementation is look into that acceleration, monitor it. Let's see where we are as we move along. Please make sure that you have a robust global framework for the SAF. And we have agreed that the framework that we will use, and what basically we would be calling SAF in that discussion, was what we call CORSIA eligible fuel. So what is that? We have a global offsetting, and there we have put criteria and emissions factors for us to call something sustainable. So it's a pass-fail criteria. You come with your SAF. You have to go through a process for evaluation to see if you pass through that criteria. If you pass through that criteria, we accept you as an eligible CORSIA fuel, and only those are considered in our framework as SAF to guarantee that we have this global integrity in the fuel we'll be using for international aviation. Then capacity building is the third. So just to say that the work to do that, put that framework together is huge. There's every day new feedstocks that come to be evaluated by ICAO on their life cycle emissions reductions factors. Every day there's a new pathway that has to be approved, and that has to be approved in terms of the safety of the flight as well. It's a huge work behind that, and has to be keeping up with this acceleration. We cannot have a request to accelerate things, and then we cannot keep up with the standards and frameworks that will be embedded for that to be produced, right? Without that, they cannot be produced or accepted or commercialized or accounted for. So we have to keep up with that technical framework very high. Just a caveat here, because this is big. The third one is capacity building. And there we have really to say that this clean energy transition is a marathon, where we have some states in ICAO that are already in the 100 meters and really speeding up, but we have some that are still looking and saying, do I have to have tennis shoes? Which ones? You know, so we really have to give them a lot of holding hand, because without that, believe me, we need 193 states producing that SAF to get to the numbers that you just saw from Haldane in the screen. All those states have to be involved, and they have to start, and we have to help them start. So we have ACT SAF, which is Assistance Capacity Building and Training for SAF, and inside that program, we are now doing 20 feasibility studies, mostly in the African states, to make sure that they awake their potential, that they can have somehow a notion of, is that something that I can pursue or not? Is this bankable or not? So initial economic studies of the market, all of that. And this is huge, okay? So ACTA for the capacity building. And the fourth thing we are doing to implement that framework is financing. So guys, we have estimated when we were deciding on the long-term goal that we could have around 60% of the reduction coming for SAF, but the investments that we would need for that were around $3.2 trillion, cumulative up to 2050. So financing is huge. And financing has a lot of facets, but one of them is accessibility to the financial market, which is something a little bit complicated, because if you have to produce in all states, some of those states come with risk, with a lot of risk. So we have to facilitate their access to the financing so that they can start that new industry. And that's very important. So we have established something called Finvest. Finvest is to provide accessibility of projects in those countries to the financing. So right now we have an initial agreement with IRENA. IRENA has a platform that already links with 14 banks, 2 of them de-risking organizations. And we are moving with them and exploring other possibilities for financing under the Finvest hub in ICAO. And we are doing all of that with a lot intensity because our mandate is to accelerate. So we have to push to be able to deliver a sustainable aviation that will be net zero 2050 and that will not leave any of our countries behind. So the non-country left behind for ICAO is something very important. We have 193 of them. It's not a one-fits-all. We are working with policies right now. We are requesting our states to really, really pay attention to everything that was already decided in ICAO, and most of our states have now included the ICAO framework as the basis for their policies, which is great because we need a level playing field for that to happen globally. So that's very important. And we are now working with the producers, with the financing, with the agriculture side. We have so many new partners for aviation to be able to deliver in that area. We are very, very encouraged by the progress we have seen. I invite you all to take a look at the website of ICAO. We have something in ICAO that's part of the very first one. Remember, the monitoring of everything. We have a website in ICAO that's the tracker tools. And there you see the evolution we had throughout the years already, and recently on the numbers of airports that are delivering SAF, the number of off-take agreements that airlines are putting forward, the level of investment that is being announced, the number of refineries that are announced, in plan, built, and producing over and over. But we update that every single day. And that is a very good indicator for us that things are happening every single day. This is really happening and happening fast. So we are very positive that we will get there. So I think with that, Haldane, I gave an overview of, and if anyone, I will stay a little bit with you. We are Transport Day, right? So we have one event after the other. We are very happy to exchange all of that very good news, I would say, from aviation. And thank you for your attention.
Yeah, sure.
I think you have to speak in the mic.
Jane, thank you very much. You know, I think that well, many thanks to ICAO, because as you said, you know, I look at ICAO as the voice.
Now it's good.
Good. Jane, many thanks for this. I look at ICAO for many years as the voice of safety and efficiency. And as you said, 50,000 standards is a foundation of the most safe transportation. I have only one question. Why CARSIA only? Because, you know, we all remember that CARSIA was, you know, developed for international, for long-haul flights. But if we want to compete with the high-speed ground transportation, we need to accelerate SAF introduction to the short-haul, you know, missions as well. So why CARSIA only?
So CARSIA only, you have to understand, it's not CARSIA only as a scheme is the framework that is used to consider SAF in CORSIA that is important to use. And I'll have to explain that maybe a little bit more. So CORSIA is an offsetting scheme, okay? We have a certain level, not going into much detail, around 2020. And this sector will not go beyond that level because we have this agreement and a carbon neutral growth goal already approved. So if the sector goes beyond that level, and meaning we could not reduce within the sector, we have to then offset that emissions. That can happen in two ways. Either you can use an eligible unit for course in the market, and it means like that. There is a criteria. The programs have to come to ICAO. They have to be assessed and pass that criteria, until they are eligible to CORSIA. They are published, available on the web, and there is 1 ton of CO2 reduction from that is what the airlines can use using many programs. The other way you can comply with CORSIA is through SAF. So I have to have also an approach to consider how SAF can be put in CORSIA. How do we do that? There is also a criteria. Not every SAF is fit for purpose, let's say, to be eligible in CORSIA. There's 14 criteria, and that's what we use for evaluating the SAF. It's not ICAO that evaluates that. We have schemes that we have approved that are global schemes that can do sustainability criteria, sustainability assessment of the fuels. You put your batch, they assess, and they see that batch of fuel complies with all standards, water, soil, CO2 reduction, does not have double counting. There's a lot of standards there. And that is then considered eligibility to CORSIA. So when we had the conference last year, what happened is they wanted to ensure that the framework that ICAO was approving with all its states was one that would ensure the environmental robustness of the SAF. And we, ICAO, we are the only ones in the world that have an international criteria and standards for SAF. We had to do that because otherwise we could not have CORSIA. We didn't want to do that, guys. We are aviation. But we had to do that so that we could have these rules and standards to comply with CORSIA. So they said, we are going to adopt the framework using CORSIA eligibility criteria as the basis. Not CORSIA, but the CORSIA eligibility criteria for SAF as the basis to say this is SAF. And that's big. That's big. That's big. It's robust, it's environmentally sound.
And the useful thing with that is that the criteria already existed. It wasn't having to reinvent the wheel that the same countries and organizations had already spent a lot of time putting together. So
and
that was quite
many countries now, they are putting together their policies for SAF, which is very important. It's not a one-fit-all, but the big majority uses all this regulatory framework we have developed in ICAO as the basis for their policies, which creates this level playing field. We don't, I'll say I don't care, but with a caveat here, the feedstock specifically, if passes the criteria, good, because it's hard to pass this criteria. So we don't name the feedstocks that we agree or not agree. Every time that a feedstock is submitted, either it passes the criteria or not. So we are agnostic. We are agnostic on the feedstock itself. It's the criteria that will say is SAF or not.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jane, for that overview. I'm now going to ask our panel to come up on stage. Excellent. And I'll introduce them. So, first of all, we have Anup Jagwani, who is the Global Head of Agribusiness and Forestry for the International Finance Corporation. Please come up on stage. We have Asmara Klein, who is the Head of Strategic Policy Partnerships for Topsoe. We have Thomas Cock-Blank, who is the Managing Director for the Rocky Mountain Institute. Do we have Thomas with us? Oh,
Thomas.
You're Thomas. Okay, please come up on stage. And then we have Katagay Olkin, who I hopefully pronounced that okay.
Charlie.
Charlie, okay, excellent, that's easier. Who's the Strategy and Sustainability Executive Director for Tüpraş from Turkey. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to focus this discussion really around the question that I raised, but also that Jane talked about as well, which is how do we make sure that no country is left behind as we move towards the quantities of SAF that we need? How do we make sure that we are focusing on developing economies as well? But maybe because you're the organizer of the events, Esma, I'm going to come to you and ask about Topsoe and what you do, what role do you have in the SAF space, and also what kind of SAF can be produced with your technologies and how that's starting to move into the discussion around developing economies as well.
Yes, thank you, Haldane. Very happy to set the scene and to be here today. I thank the panelists in particular to have accepted the invitation and for Jane's introduction, which was very informative, I thought. So let us start with what is SAF. There's no one SAF, as Jane alluded to it. There are many ways to produce SAF. At the moment, in terms of ASTM approved pathways, we have 8 of them, and then we have 3 co-processing pathways. The most mature one is what we call HEFA. So basically it's using any kind of oil. This can be a virgin oil, a waste oil, an animal fat that can be transformed via hydroprocessing into SAF. Most SAF today is via the HEFA route, and that's where Topsoe is leading. We have over 50 references actually in producing renewable diesel, and we have about 40% of that SAF market on the HEFA route. But we're also trying to unlock other feedstocks because there's a limit to how many vegetable oils and animal fats you can find. And so we're trying to work on what we call advanced biofuels. So that is waste biomass, which you can either liquefy, so basically making a caramel, or you can gasify and then transform that into an e-fuel. The problem with that is that both the liquefaction and gasification are not there yet. So at the moment it's ASTM approved, but the reality is that we won't see production before the 2030s on those. And then the last bit that we're doing is e-fuels. The ASTM approved pathway here is using the Fischer-Tropsch route, which means you take renewable power, transform that into green hydrogen to have a molecule. You add to that ideally a sustainable source of biogenic or of CO2, and you produce eSAF. Again, this is very early stages, but we do have a very advanced technology for that, and hopefully we will be able to deploy it soon. And then we're also working on developing a new way to produce eSAF called methanol to jet. This is not ASTM approved, and there we're working with different partners to make sure we get ASTM approval soon. And so to your question, what are we doing to make sure we scale this? We are very much at the dawn of SAF production. And as I explained in the first part, we are focused on the technology. So it's really on us to make sure that all the pathways and the technology solutions are available. So we invest not only in the R&D piece, so developing new technologies, but also improving the ones that are available. As I mentioned, HEFA is available today, but we're working on many other pathways. When you invest in a plant that has to last, 1-2 decades, you want to make sure that your solution is competitive in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And so improving that technology is really also key for us and pass those improvements on to our customers. But I would say we also see our role in being a knowledge partner to the industry because it's the very beginning. We need to learn to make that new product. And so being a knowledge partner to, especially in Asia actually, where we see a lot of developers being interested in SAF, that means a little bit more higher service to those types of customers, at least in comparison to the more traditional refiners. And so that means beyond being a technology licenser, offering, for instance, to extend our network, opening our connections, but also helping on execution strategies. So really being that partner to our clients, our SAF producers, but also to the wider ecosystem. We still see a lot of lack of knowledge and understanding, especially in emerging and developing countries around SAF. And so we want to make sure that airlines are aware of what are the requirements, certifications. As Jane explained, it's very complex. There are a lot of aspects because COSIA is one scheme, but a lot of countries are developing their own scheme. So UK SAF is not European SAF, is not American SAF, is not Japanese SAF, is not COSIA SAF. And so you need to make sure that everyone can navigate those systems. And we do that through, we have an annual SAF summit where we convene the ecosystem and our clients in particular. We also joined actually the ACT SAF program to make sure we can leverage our expertise and share that with policymakers in ICAO so that they're aware of what technologies are available. We have country workshops where we also share that knowledge, and we actually have also a podcast, Fuel for Thought, where we also share through our experts some of the insights we've gained on SAF production.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview of what you're doing. Maybe can you just give us a very brief idea of what the new pathway that you're looking at is, MTJ, and why that's such an exciting opportunity for you, in a few words?
Yes. So I have to go back to hydrogen to explain that. Hydrogen is a fantastic molecule. As you know, it's in our atmosphere. It's very present, but it's a very tricky molecule. It doesn't like to be captured and stored. So it's very expensive to store hydrogen. And when you have a fuel production facility, you need hydrogen for different reasons, in particular for purifying your fuel. And that's especially true when you produce eSAF. And so when you have to store it, that adds cost. That's not the case when you have methanol to jet, because then you get rid of that storage question. Because as you know, when you have renewable hydrogen, you have renewable power, that's intermittent, etc. And so that's why we think methanol to jet can be a very exciting solution for e-fuel, because it can really help bring down costs thanks to the fact that you don't need storage.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to stick on the production side of things and come to you. So Trupas is aiming to become Turkey's leading SAF producer. What can you tell us about your plan, and what have you been working on already to make that a reality?
Thanks a lot for this opportunity again. Just before saying what we are aiming to do, I just wanted to give a brief information about Tüpraş. We are the largest company, industrial and energy company in Turkey, part of the largest conglomerate in Turkey, Koç Group. So we are basically a downstream player in the oil and gas market. We produce and distribute and trade fuel products. And we have announced our transition strategy back in 2021. That was our first announcement of a long-term target. And at that time, we announced that by 2050, we will be carbon neutral. So looking at the peers in our industry, the downstream players only, we are, I'm honored to say that we are very first in giving this commitment. And we identified a few pillars in this area, because we need to pick the areas where we are competitive and try to make a real difference. And aviation was one of them. Together with hydrogen, electricity, and we see this system as an integrated business model. And in biofuels, we deliberately picked SAF only. We are not going into HVO or green diesel, clean diesel, whatever you call it. The reason being, the road transportation, one way or another, in the future, it will be electrified entirely. So, but in aviation, just you showed it. SAF is most probably one of the very few solutions in this market. And since we're already providing 65% of the jet in Turkey, like 4 million tons a year, we said we want to be the partner of airlines and airports in Turkey, because Turkey, we are good at a lot of things, but one good thing we are really good at is aviation. Turkish Airlines, Istanbul Airport, everyone hopefully been there at least once or transferred from there. So it's a very big hub, and we want to maintain the country's competitiveness in that sense. And we said if SAF is not in an airport, then it won't be a global airport going forward, and the aviation market cannot be global. That's why we, without hearing any commitments from the government, any mandates, any commitments from airlines or airports, we said we are going in. And 3 years ago, we signed the technology agreement and selected HEFA. And currently, we are in the process of building a 400,000 tons SAF plant. This is processing capacity, so it's 75% of it's going to be SAF. And we are, like Jane mentioned, we are opting for waste materials mostly, and this is vegetable oils or other biomass, including animal fats. So we are trying to be as diverse as possible, because the challenge, which will come later, is going to be raw materials. And this is what we're thinking at the moment. And the first step is starting next year, we will be co-processing and producing the first SAF in the market, and providing airlines and airports. And most importantly, we are also starting to trade the raw materials next year, which is going to help us learning the raw materials, because we don't know anything about them. It's a totally different market, so that's a big challenge. And with trading, what we are trying to achieve is that we learn the qualities, we learn the specs, and how best mix those stuff to produce SAF in a most efficient manner. With that, let me.
Okay, no, that's excellent. So 300,000 tons of SAF being produced from next year?
No, that's the second phase.
Okay.
Co-processing is next year.
Okay.
It's going to be 20,000 to start with.
Okay.
By 2028, our greenfield unit will be up and running, and at that time we will be having 300,000.
Excellent. All right. So we need to find ways of taking that model and putting it in other parts of the world, including Africa and Latin America as well. And I think that's where International Finance Corporation comes in. Maybe just explain a little bit about what IFC is and does. Just watch yourself there, you don't fall off the stage. And also talk a little bit about de-risking projects in developing economies, because that seems to be one of the key barriers that people are looking at, is how do we de-risk these discussions?
Thank you, I appreciate that. And so just give you a sense to start with, as the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, we provide over $40 billion in long-term capital in the emerging markets. And doing large-scale projects that have CapEx needs with long-term capital needed, that's what we specialize in. And so IFC is committed to decarbonization of all the hard-to-abate sectors. So when we, for example, go to the board and say, hey, we're financing this airport, so say, okay, what are you doing about the rest of the airline business? And so our really what we're trying to do now is scale up the SAF financing. And some of the tools that we bring are particularly key. And I'll break them into two parts, knowing that SAF is really the primary way we're going to decarbonize the industry for the next, let's say, 2-3 decades, until the aircraft designs change and we get really something very different, right? And so what we bring to the table are a range of financial instruments, from long-term debt to equity, and that we can structure in kind of depending on the need of the project. And I'm going to later on talk about a couple of examples that we've been successful in. We also bring, to Jane's point earlier, about capacity. So there are two aspects, especially given that the feedstock can be an issue in many instances. And I particularly come from a background on agribusiness, and there we have looked at the feedstock elements. When you look at a processing company, and here you're looking at SAF plants, you need the feedstock, and that is especially a challenge in many of the emerging market contexts. So what we bring is not just the financing, but also capacity on how to manage the supply chain aspects, some of the environmental and social risks that may be associated with the project. And finally, in some instances, we can help on studies that may be needed, feasibility studies in some contexts. What we would define something called upstream. We bring in financing together with other players to help build the case. To Jane's point earlier, some of those studies being done in sub-Saharan Africa, we'll be looking forward to the results of that and how we can support companies in scaling up in those areas.
Okay. Are there some successful examples that you've had in financing, maybe not necessarily just in SAF, but in other areas that we can build on to learn from as well?
Sure, we have lots of successful examples. In SAF itself, they are limited, right? Because we know we are at the beginning and the early stages. So I'm going to jump right into the examples. With Eni in Kenya, we're supporting a project there to help them source biofuel. And in that project, they've got over 200,000 farmers that they're going to source from. So imagine the challenge that's going to be there in managing that supply chain. So they don't need us just for the financing, which we've of course mobilized $135 million in long-term capital from our own pocket, but also the Italian Climate Fund is coming side along us, right? And we're bringing the technical expertise in the both on the production side, but especially the supply chain side, organizing that feedstock, which will come from some of the oil seeds. And you want to be careful about the food versus fuel debate as well, right, in this instance. And so we look at those issues carefully. And so we've got a few examples, and I can talk one more later, that we are looking to close shortly.
Okay, now that's sort of creating opportunities for jobs and opportunities for economic growth as well as green fuels at the same time. Come to RMI next. One of the ideas that I think the RMI has been working on is green corridors from a shipping perspective. Obviously that requires a lot of cooperation between governments, industry and others. What kind of cooperation do you think is happening in aviation at the moment? How can we sort of learn from that green corridors idea? Maybe explain it in brief words as well.
So shipping is distinctive from aviation because aviation is operating more with drop-in fuels. So basically you can blend in fuels with existing sort of propulsion technology. So you don't necessarily need as much technology shift on the aircraft to enable SAF uptake. In shipping, it's different. So when you shift fuels in shipping, in many cases, there are some drop-in fuels, but for deeper decarbonization, you need technology shifts on the ship, which means that you need not only to have supply in one port, but in every port that that particular ship stops at. So from that perspective, the corridor concept becomes a little bit less important for aviation because if your aircraft lands at an airport that doesn't have SAF, you can still operate with normal aviation fuel, right? So that's a huge difference. And I think what is, however, the problem we're solving for is that not in order to motivate or sort of have enough offtake at one point for a commercial scale SAF plant, it goes beyond what you can pick up with voluntary offtake or even mandated offtakes in specific airports today. And there's another, I think, gap. Speaking of emerging markets, I think one of the biggest benefits longer term for emerging markets is that we will fundamentally localize the supply chains, right? So historically, based on crude oil, the origination point for the fuel is the crude reserves, and then that means that all the origination benefits and profits go to those markets. But with independent of which pathway you choose, whether it's HEFA, you source feedstocks regionally, or if it's e-fuels, you also have regional renewables, and the inputs become much more regionalized. But and in many emerging markets, the actual cost structure is quite beneficial. The renewables are generally attractive in terms of fundamental cost. And in developed markets where you have the demand, the cost is higher for renewables because of congestions and permitting and infrastructure, infrastructure constraints. So we have this situation in the market where the willingness to pay is the highest in developed markets, but the value for money, if you like, is highest in the emerging markets. But emerging markets cater to budget airlines, and again, the willingness to pay the extra voluntary premium is not generally there. So all this comes together into a mechanism that we refer to as book and claim, where you enable pooling of demand of multiple off-takers into a single investment, but it also enables the demand from one location to benefit investments in another location. It's still, and this is important, it's still not, it's definitely not offsetting. So we're not enabling to, to keep it simple, to just continue burning or normal aviation fuel and plant trees. We're actually facilitating investments into low carbon aviation fuels, and that has been quite successful. We've had a few procurement rounds, if you like, of even forward commitments, because as soon as you create this virtual product, if you like, which is the demand unit for low carbon fuels, companies have also the ability to procure into the future, and they say we want to buy this fuel not only now but for the next 5 years or 7 years, and this is what brings the certainty and de-risking into the investment project financing of the producers, which enables investments in large-scale SAF production.
So that's where we are at the moment. What needs to be done now to expand that even more, and potentially to get places like the EU, which have mandates in place, to recognize book and claim as a useful way of adding into that mandate?
So if the mandates are large enough, at some point book and claim becomes less relevant on a sort of regional market with homogeneous policy. I think, and here's a good analogy with the shipping space, depending on how EU rolls this out, but if they do allow a mechanism where you can comply, where you can over comply in parts of your portfolio to compensate for under compliance somewhere else, then that technically it shakes out as a book and claim mechanism. So the underlying mechanism can serve both voluntary markets and policy-driven markets. So over time, in a market where the mandated volumes increase over time, we anticipate that the voluntary premium and the voluntary procurement will go away, but the underlying mechanism will still be important to serve the policy market.
One of the things, excuse me, one of the things that I've always thought is that, due to the investment case, the challenge of making an investment case for SAF plants in a lot of emerging economies, having the ability to book and claim into the European system would actually help the business case there. And so I think that's a really important part of the development discussion, let alone the actual pure SAF discussion as well.
Fully agree. And again, we don't know how fast these markets will emerge, but at some point when you get sufficient velocity and sort of scale of SAF markets, I would almost anticipate that they will be traded separately as a separate commodity, and you will have enough price certainty in the market that you will have a separately traded index. So it becomes a commodity of its own. And again, we're far from that future state, though. So there's lots of scaling and market maturity that's required before we have anything close to what can be considered a bankable revenue assumption for project finance. So that's in this whole transition, we still need these mechanisms.
So that's where IFC comes in as well. And what are the kinds of mechanisms have you got in place, or have you seen being very successful that can be built upon in the SAF space as well? What else do we need to do from a policy perspective, from a development perspective?
Right. So you heard, I think, Jane, and now you heard recently on some of the factors that mitigate the risk, right? So, of course, we're looking for a sponsor that knows the business. Most of you know better than I do that, just producing the biofuel itself is not enough. You've got to have the blending, and you've got to have the right feedstock, right? And the right technology. So we rely on all these elements to come into place. An offtake agreement is fantastic to have. So just hot off the press, we're about to sign. It's approved by our board, an investment in Pakistan that's using cooking oil for sustainable aviation fuel. And imagine the impact that we were talking about earlier. Over $300 million in export revenue, so hard currency in a country like Pakistan really needed, right? So, but it is that offtake, it is the commitment by partners to offtake that helps de-risk the market side. You know that you're going to have a buyer for the next few years. So we're partnering with another financial institution, the Asian Development Bank, and bringing in this case, I was talking about a range of instruments earlier. We're bringing in equity and debt into this project to help scale that. So, but you do need the various elements in place when you bring in large amounts of capital to finance these projects.
Yeah, no, perfect role for blended finance to be part of that discussion as well. We have to wrap up in the next few minutes, but I want to come to you and just ask some of the challenges that you've seen in the discussion around building the SAF plant that you've got, and what your plans are beyond that. Are there plans for even greater scale, either in Turkey or in other parts of the region?
Thank you again. So I already mentioned the raw material part, which we secured last year. 100% of it with the largest agro trader in Turkey, and they're a regional player. So that hurdle is hopefully passed. But the next step, like Topsoe mentioned, the new technologies, and we are already working on new technologies through mainly EU Horizon projects, and we have 3 of them up and running right now to find ways to produce SAF with using different raw materials and different technologies, and which is really needed. But 2 main hurdles I see currently is book and claim. I think that is absolutely necessary for everyone until, like your theoretical scenario, we are in an efficient market with stable and policies around the world. But until then, we have to have it. Otherwise, airports won't be able to supply because none of them have different infrastructures that can serve normal jet versus SAF included jet, something like that. So that is a big problem. So that is first thing. And the second one is the standards and policies and definitions. And Jane mentioned they have an agnostic view of what they're thinking. So in that fashion, I see ICAO similar to IRA of United States. So they're agnostic, but we have European Union, which is saying this is what you should be producing with, and otherwise it is not EU certified SAF. I think these kind of different certifications, different rules has to be abolished. Otherwise, the ramp up of the industry is really hard because we are having discussions with clients and they're saying, I'm flying to Europe. Some of them have 2%, some of them have 5%, some require ISCC EU certificate, but I have an obligation to Corsia. Corsia requires mass balance and the aviation company to have actual SAF in their tanks. So there's a lot of noise in the market that is kind of slowing down the increase in the industry, the growth in the industry.
Excellent. Of global standards is really important. Absolutely. Esmar, I'm going to come to you for the final word. Where do you see us going? What do you see as the trends going forward in this space? Give us some optimism.
I am actually very optimistic for emerging and developing countries because we mentioned the feedstock. Just to give you a number, the cost of SAF, 80% is linked to your feedstock costs. So if you have good feedstock, affordable feedstock, that can make a huge difference. And as we discussed, if we can put systems in place like book and claim to get that initial investment into the sector, there's a lot of potential. We see the last 2 years a huge interest actually in our technology in Asia and Latin America in particular. We are partnering with different developers, but also some of the traditional refiners, which is an interesting trend because for them it's always a bit more risky to be exporting SAF to Europe or the US. So I really see a lot of traction. Now, what we do need, though, is the regulation in place. We need, and that's what Jane mentioned, we need those frameworks in place to give the assurance to investors that they have longevity on the targets, on the ambitions in the sector, and also what is SAF, what will be SAF in 10 years, etc. So it's very important to have that certainty and clear support mechanisms, as you mentioned as well.
Absolutely. No, listen, I think one of the key takeaways from COP this year for me has been the fact that for the last 15 years or so, we've been really concentrating on SAF from the aviation side, from airlines and airports and other parts of the aviation business, even though this is more of an energy discussion than an aviation-specific discussion. But this COP, I've really seen a lot of interest from a whole range of different players, from the agribusiness to energy companies, to governments as well, that are really making progress in the space in a way that's moving in the same direction as what we want to see. Obviously, we need to move faster. We need to get scale up even faster than we have already. But I think in general, the momentum has actually been really impressive to see, and it's come together at this COP and in other fora as well. So I want to thank the panel very much for your inputs and all the work that you're doing to help us in this process as well. Thank you all very much for coming, and have a good afternoon.
Pleasure. Meeting you.
Of course, indeed. Hey, thanks so much.
Oops. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.